We had such a great talk about secondary altriciality already by Karen. I'm wondering what I still have left to add. So I had to also modify my slides a little bit and make it a bit more theoretical, and especially the connection that I'm interested in is with evolutionary developmental biology, which is still a relatively new field of biology emerging in the latter half of the 20th century. And coming to anthropology, I think also in a gradual manner, and only in recent years has there been more explicit talk of this kind of anthropological evo-devo or question that's how this type of evolutionary studies might apply to humans. And I think this might simply be a very interesting starting point to reconsider Portmann's work in general, also in zoology, the whole question of co-evolution of sense organs and organic displays, for example. This co-evolutionary dimension might be something very interesting from the point of view of evo-devo. Also, the question of precocial and altricial species, so what might be the driving differences in development that generate this type of variety. And as we were having such great difficulty still in examining humans and primates in a comparative manner, it might be rather interesting to ask if there might be connections to the sort of evolutionary research that has been already been conducted. Although at the same time, I have to say that to my knowledge, it really has been looked at very little. So I'm just presenting this as a kind of short historical narrative and highlighting some of the theoretical problems and questions that I find interesting, and I think might be helpful if we're approaching Portmann's legacy from a theoretical point of view and trying to find his place in the history of science and see why he might still be an interesting author with important things to say for the future of science. Very briefly about the modern science of the evo-devo. Most of you are probably familiar, so I try to provide just this brief sketch in the sense that it would be generally the study of the developmental systems and mechanisms and their evolution, and mainly focused on such relatively mechanistic molecular developmental genetic approach to form and morphology. This is on the one hand. On the other hand, and where it gets perhaps more interesting and connected to Portmann's problematic and approaches, the question how evolutionary change might itself be mediated by developmental mechanisms such as, for example, described earlier by Waddington, stabilization, buffering, canalization, etc. All these are essentially problems of epigenetics, where we would be seeing development as a relatively highly autonomous process and the kind of self-regulatory process which might function even in the presence of certain genetic variations and mutations, and still be able to find solutions to the problem that have arisen, for example, certain mutational damage, etc. So there is a sort of question of emergence, very clearly implicit or even explicit here. And of course then the more general question as well, whether and how variations in developmental systems could serve as a source for evolutionary change. Of course this is still a theoretical and quite open question, because we can never really study this quite on the spot, but we can make very educated inferences and interesting and well-founded hypotheses based on the study of developmental genes and regulatory processes, and the diversity of form that we can see these giving rise to in case of certain individuals, for example, and then asking whether the same kind of mechanisms might be implicated in interspecies variability, for example. And of course here, especially crucial has been the discovery of developmental genes and developmental toolkits, such as the homeobox or host family genes, in giving rise to such ordered variations, and later on more work on the regulatory systems which might guide the development think all these questions would be rather interesting for Portmann, especially if we're trying to position this in a more more broad theoretical context, including epigenetics and morphology, and not just reduce kind of a molecular mechanics, but trying to look at their ecological implications. So recently has been more talk also about evo-devo, for example, and I think the problematics of anthropology will especially, of course, benefit from this kind of more wide-scale synthesis, which in the human case, of course, will ultimately have to include cultural factors as well. But in the narration of the evo-devo story, of course, we very often hear that it's seen as a kind of discipline of the late 19th century, early 20th century, which re-emerged towards the end of it, the 20th century, and now is seen also as a 21st century discipline, in the sense that it's probably providing major themes for the future of biological research. But in between that has been a very significant, very long gap. And this is not the case just because the modern synthesis that was predominant in the middle of the 20th century, which founded the ground principles of evolutionary study, tended to, or almost entirely excluded the question of developmental mechanisms, excluded embryology, etc., to make evolution into objective discipline, so to say, formal population genetics, etc. So, leaving aside questions of ontogeny to the extent it's possible, and all sorts of developmental complexities which might introduce variation into this process and make it much more difficult to study in this manner. Nevertheless, this type of narrative, of course, excludes certain important figures. So we cannot probably quite say that this early tradition of comparative morphology and embryology that characterizes a lot of thinking in biology in the late periods of 19th century, which was still a descriptive biology, of course, but still already saw clearly that there have to be some kind of connections and parallels in the way variability is generated through developmental mechanisms and in the variability of species that we can see in the paleontological record that was already becoming available very well at the time. So this is, for example, well illustrated in this controversy of recapitulation, for example, this question of embryos as if repeating the phylogenetic stages of their ancestors, and perhaps it was also certain misformulations of this principle that led to the certain discreditation of developmental studies, but I think this is a minor influence. And it's also surprising that there were both very mechanistically oriented developmental researchers as well as more holistic or organically oriented researchers. Nevertheless, neither of them really ended up influencing modern synthesis at all. And even, let's say, the most relevant and appropriate reformulations or formulations of the recapitulation hypothesis, which are still seen as quite valid, for example, as formulated by Králové and Portmann, these have not influenced the kind of thinking that became dominant. So, on the other hand, I think it's also false to say that it completely disappeared. So, Konrad Wellington is certainly the best known figure in this case. He continued to publish extensively critical writings critical of the modern synthesis, trying to bring embryology and genetics into the picture and show how crucial contribution this could be making to our understanding of what exactly, how we would think about the gene, about its effects. Can we say that is a gene for a trait, or do we have to look at the developmental network? So of course he went in this latter direction. And I think we can place Portmann quite fruitfully in this series of largely overlooked, marginalized evolutionary thinkers who, of course, started to already shed more light on this and bring this closer to the center and mainstreams of biology, especially his work on ontogeny and phylogeny. in the 1970s, but also that was already clearly prefiguring the emergence of modern evo-devo in the early 80s with the discovery of developmental genetic processes. So my interesting, let's say, my interest here would be how do we really position Portmann in this story of between 20th century developmental biology. What would be the contribution of or status of this distinction of altricial and precocial developmental types, and for example, how could we think of the very clear empirical discoveries that he made regarding the different ontogeny of birds and mammals, the different evolutionary origins of precociality and altriciality and birds and mammals, for example. These are, I think, very interesting questions from an evo-devo perspective, but to my knowledge, these have not really been studied or answered so far. So I think we can place this question in a kind of broader context, asking what would be the missing links in the movement of evo-devo. This would be kind of synergetic or complementary to Portmann's thinking, or even present in his thinking to an extent that would be also interesting. Here, I think we can include processes such as niche construction, possible rules of behavior in guiding and channeling evolutionary changes, certainly also epigenetic inheritance. More recently, also questions of symbiogenesis, followed by a theory for it, which really rather radically challenges our notions of what constitutes really a biological individual, as we see that these are to such an extent made up of bacterial colonies, which even have their own inheriting systems, etc., etc. So also, and here quite crucially, the question of where do we place physiological evolution and the evolution of life history traits in this evo-devo perspective, because it's generally the thought that the contribution of regulatory elements and coding, protein evolution might be rather different in these two cases. So if on the one hand we're looking at questions of form, morphology, coloration, general organismic patterning, then the mechanisms governing their production might be quite different from those which regulate biochemical and physiological traits, which we can quite often pinpoint to specific mutations, for example, leading to differences in eye coloration or certain hormonal changes, etc., etc. And this, I think, is an interesting question that should be considered here, because I think Portmann's notion was clearly trying to say that we cannot actually separate these two phenomena. Morphology, physiology, and behavior need to be somehow integrated into a common account. And I already mentioned this problems of co-evolutionary dynamics and the problem of secondary altricial and precocial types. So later on, one of the main commentators and followers of Portmann, Roger Martin, primatologist, has actually pointed out that according to later fossil records, Portmann's key intuitions have been found rather dramatic confirmations in the sense that we can see that in the evolution of mammals and mammalian, different mammalian lineages, this distinction of precociality is probably extremely ancient and goes back to the very origin of certain lineages, such as, for example, hoofed mammals or bats, etc. Already fossils found from 50 million years ago point to the fact that at the time they were already precocial. So these are extremely obvious. If we are not afraid of using it here the term archetypic in this Goethean sense or otherwise, as we've then it would be one context of thinking about this. Evidence similarly points out that in as many as 10 different mammalian lineages, this type of transition to precociality seems to have occurred independently. So this, I think, really raises questions of extreme interest for evo-devo, because clearly we're dealing here with very large-scale coordinated changes in functioning of physiology and cognition on the one hand, but also in the body plans, in the morphology, in the developmental mechanics that leads to these differences. More on this question of possible integration with more functional accounts. So we can again make perhaps a distinction between development of functions, where we can simply see what are the changes, or examine what are the changes in development which lead to different sorts of functional outcomes, be they regarding respiratory physiology or multiform physiology or otherwise, and asking also about the question of functional development, where we're interested in how these changes in, let's say, respiratory physiology or motor physiology might place new constraints on the types of evolutionary dynamics that are more likely to occur. And I think these questions are very interesting because they really point to the extreme plasticity of organisms and ability to stabilize functions in completely new conditions and ecological contexts. So I've illustrated this here with an example of a two-legged goat who has learned to walk and manages his or her life quite well. And this is an old study that was carried out already in, I think, early 20th century, that was also quite in detail commented upon later, because this leads to a restructuring of the organism's morphology. And we might think that this kind of changes, if the organism is viable, ultimately they do not need to be eradicated from evolution, and they might actually function as a sort of buffer, again, as we mentioned earlier, for developmental mechanisms. But here we see that this buffering is actually also occurring in the case of behavior. I don't know if I can activate this link here. No,
maybe this
well, it's just an illustration, so it's perhaps not so important. I just skipped it because we don't have so much time either. But what is interesting, this video shows that there is another goat in whom only the forelimbs are preserved due to some developmental malfunction or genetic mutation, and likewise this goat is able to move around and manage his or her life. So I think this type of organism level physiological factors can have evolutionary implications that are very interesting, and in general point to the questions of agency and niche construction in evolution, which has somewhat been on the background so far of evo-devo, are still a way to be integrated with them, and also the question of animal cultures. Could this kind of reorganizations for a new inheritance system that operates on top of classical genetic or epigenetic ones? I think I leave the question of microgenesis aside for the moment, and just point out also that the question of natural selection as this kind of major functional driver of evolution according to adaptationist and Darwinian dynamics, Darwinian accounts of evolution, still actually awaits to be integrated with accounts and approaches of evo-devo, which are focused on, let's say, the developmental constraints, which necessarily always guide the fate of any new mutations and evolutionary changes. And as mentioned, I think these are particularly interesting questions if we're starting to think about evo-devo, and Portmann's contribution here really seems to be his very systematic type of theorizing, and also his acceptance of the notion of certain organismic teleology. And I'll come back to this, but I just want to point out that it seems that this systematic type of theorizing is exactly at the source of, and also this teleological type of theorizing is at the source of his ability to anticipate so many later findings. For example, as Karen mentioned, this hypothesis of metabolic constraints, as well as I think it would be rather appropriate to think the different accounts that have been given, for example, of the question why human babies are born so much fat. This has classically found again a rather mechanical and kind of adaptationist explanation in looking at the thermoregulatory effects of this process, whereas more recent findings are pointing out that it might have crucial effects for brain development as well. So again, we see a kind of analogy to the finding of the metabolic constraints, that it might be actually that this is considered as a sort of pre-adaptation, if we wish, which has to be considered in the context of the whole human life mode and niche, and we cannot really make good sense of it if we look at it just in terms of this proximate mechanical causation. And this I will briefly illustrate it here. It's from an illustration from another article, which shows how this question of finality teleology has been bracketed in general, even in more epigenetic and holistic terms of evolution, just because it somehow seems unscientific. And of course, we can understand this in historical context, because no one here will be claiming, Portmann or any other one, that evolution as such will be teleological. It just makes the argument that if we consider as organisms as teleological agents, then we will arrive at a different account of evolution. So able to recognize the sort of autonomous agency that organisms might possess in covering ontogeny. So this would add on top of the material and formal causation associated with the genetic system and the various organic substances and the efficient causes, let's say the proximate causes from the environment which govern them, and this would try to provide kind of additional layer of explanation and look at the context. So yes, maybe we can give a material, formal and efficient mechanical account of a large variety of processes and adaptations, yet if we don't really take into account this final question, which in the Portmannian case would of course concern, for example, the special unique mode of human ontogeny, especially in the first year of life, then we might be missing out what is really driving these processes here and their organization. So I've given a brief quote from Portmann to illustrate this, and well, I'm not going to read it, but I'm reading it here for maybe a few seconds so you can absorb it. I'm coming to two authors who have been explicitly proclaimed as the forefathers of current evolutionary developmental thinking in anthropology, or evo-devo anthropos, as it's been abbreviated. And these are Dutch anatomist Louis Wolk and his theory of fetalization, as well as the studies of Adolf Schultz. So I've forgotten the dates. He was born in late 19th century and died in 1976. So these were really quite important improvements over the earlier stages of theorizing in the latter part of the 19th century, which were still very limited in terms of the sample sizes of fossil or comparative evidence that was available, and were limited to very few and readily measurable features such as body mass or head circumference, and mainly they remained very qualitative and just based on a few specimens. So this precluded any kind of more systematic theorizing. It really didn't allow to make any educated guesses about the nature or extent of variation that is present in various species or in their development, and it remained a lot more descriptive and quite devoid of any unifying principle. And this was about to change with the works of Louis Polk quite considerably, and the brief kind of illustration that often serves to highlight the essence of his theory of utilization is here, just showing to what extent juvenile chimpanzee is more similar to humans than an adult one. Being quite logical to the guess that perhaps if humans had any ape-like ancestors, then it is a certain retention of the earlier phases of their development that might have led to the emergence of modern humans or processes of hominization. So he was a widely influential anatomist, and his theory of fertilization was widely influential. He wasn't the first to speak about fertilization, but he was the first to apply this theory or this line of evolutionary development of thinking to humans, and claiming indeed that all essential human traits which define our species can be seen as prefigured in the juvenile stages of other primates, our closest relatives, as opposed to their adult members. So recognizing this construct as belonging to a wider set of evolutionary developmental ideas, wider set of ideas about heterochromic evolution in particular, Portmann saw that very clearly we probably need to challenge this whole edifice of explanation, the strategy of explanation in case we want to make good sense of what makes humans so different. He clearly didn't agree with the notion that it could be explained quite as simply as Polk did, even though he had admitted that a few such traits, of course, a few traits might have evolved by such means. So we can consider Polk's distinction between primary. Perhaps I will skip it. I think I just have a few minutes left, so I probably will have to skip a little bit. So essentially, if we bring it down to just a few simplified conclusions, then he was already drawing on the findings of Schultz, who himself had concluded that this is probably an oversimplification, and comparative morphological studies, which Schultz himself had initiated in the early 20th century, don't really quite match up with this expectation of fetalization. So indeed, visually, the juvenile stages bear very human traits if we compare them to adults, such as size of the forehead in particular, the flatness of the face, etc. But all these are the results of looking exclusively at the head. So if we consider the whole proportions of bodily structures, then quite a different picture emerges, because we see that in higher apes, these animals are born very like bodily structures, whereas in humans, the changes that take place in the relative proportion of different limbs until reaching adulthood are very much more significant in comparison. So, I think I have to skip a little bit more. As we saw in the previous presentation, in the case of humans, we really have to, if we can use a term such as regression or retardation at all, which folks use, then it's in fact quite inappropriate, because this so-called regression occurs to a completely new type of semi-altricial form, which is in fact nothing similar to what we see in our closest primate relatives, who are indeed extremely precocial already at birth, and of course even less in analogy to the primary altriciality that Karen also emphasized. So in this context, it would be even better than to describe human development as slow, not as delayed, but simply as slow, but not delayed or retarded. It would be better to be very careful about explanations of heterochrony, or as in seeing the human species as exemplifying a certain malfunction with respect to animal norms. And this was very lectured at the time in relation to the Mendelssohn concept that Galen, for example, was developing. Instead of that, he proposed indeed that we have to consider this adaptation to a much more complex world if we want to understand the specifics of early human development, and indeed development early extending to the very early stages. So Philip also, I think, mentioned this case of structuring of the vertebral column, which already in the first few months of life shows certain pre-adaptations to upright posture, and I think there are other properties of the pelvic region which don't have any heterochronic explanations at all, and rather should be considered in terms of this apomorphic functional adaptation that humans have achieved with bipedal locomotion. And so it's just to highlight the limitations of this fetalization concept, the later neoteny concept, and in general the application of comparative embryological methods. I'm through the numbers, right?
Yeah, you could sum up.
I tried to sum up very quickly. So, essentially, I can quite safely skip this because so much of this was included in Karen's about precocial and altricial development and why humans don't really fit either pattern. What I come to as a sort of conclusion is this summary image. So we talked about what is so special about human development, and we saw also this same type of data in the previous talk. Here is a very early characterization of this exceptional developmental trajectory of early human maturation, where we can indeed see that this embryonic rate of development appears to continue quite well throughout the first year of life, after which there is a gradual decline in the speed of brain growth, for example, as shown here on this image in terms of the growth of brain size. And we can see how clearly this distinguishes us both from higher apes and from monkeys. Of course, the difference between the latter two is also quite telling, as we can see from later studies, but nevertheless it's quite an interesting and important contribution in the, I think, in the precise context that I've been trying to outline, which asks the question of apomorphic evolution, or evolution of qualitative novelty, and the possible parallels to evo-devo approaches. So we found some preliminary answers to when and how these human patterns first may have emerged. We still don't probably have much of a clue to what extent the evolutionary changes producing. For example, these changes in the vaginal canal of Homo erectus might have owed to changes in DNA sequence in the coding parts of the genome versus regulatory changes, for example, or what might have been the contribution of development of genes and networks. Here again I highlight this possibility that structural and functional evolution might seem like quite two different spheres when we consider coding and regulatory sequence evolution, for example, but probably in the light of Portmann's concept we can see also how closely they can be interrelated. And here my really key question is whether the establishment of new life history stages, like for example this extremely unique pattern of first year of life in the case of humans, can the emergence of this type of distinct life stages or patterns share any mechanistic principles with the mechanisms that already have been discovered in giving rise to multi-body differentiation or segmentation that have been described in more morphological studies, and where we can already speak of very precise mechanisms at the genetic level. So that's my main question. There is also a brief contrast to Schultz, essentially just to show that he didn't really include any new stages of development in the case of humans. He presumed that there have been simply heterochronic shifts, and we can, in all cases, speak of a juvenile stage reaching the reproductive maturity in adulthood, for example. But he didn't really introduce new developmental stages such as childhood or other stages that have been later introduced. And I think in this context we should probably ask how Portmann's contribution is still up to date. He clearly went beyond Schultz's approach to evo-devo as a sort of heterochronic change in the relative proportions of developmental stages, to proposing that in principle de novo life cycle stages have been evolved, perhaps gradually in the case of human evolution, of course, but nevertheless we have to look at qualitatively different life stages. And in this sense we can see that he not only extended Schultz's studies to the field of comparative neuroanatomy, but also to the field of behavioral ontogeny, and with a specific focus on the question of new life modes, new life history stages. And this goes beyond the earlier concepts that are now recognized as laying at the foundation of human evo-devo. Extremely interesting question. Is there evidence of de novo life history stage evolution in other animals? I think there are cases of mammalian primate evolution when something like this has been said to occur. In this context, we can really start to ask, is the altricial precocial distinction somehow related to this de novo emergence of life history stages in other mammals? And in case the development of genetic mechanisms that have been identified, can we use this to make some educated guesses about what has been happening in human evolution? So of course, having been giving a very theoretical and speculative talk, there is so much more detail to be gone into. Also for myself, I'm just trying to get the first pieces together here to see what distinguishes Portmann's approach from earlier evo-devo classics, and how to most productively approach it in the light of current findings, or what might be the future findings relevant for disproving or showing the further relevance of Portmann's concepts for future research. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes. Again, chance for questions, comments.
I have a question about contemporary epigenetics. Because I did once a short research on the contemporary contributions in epigenetics about, for example, the expression of genes or non-coding DNA and such issues. And it seemed to me that they are trying to do this research without teleology, just searching for efficient causes or material factors. And I'm not so sure that in the last 20 years, epigenetics, this kind of epigenetics still belongs to evo-devo, the evo-devo fields, as you presented this field. But I just wanted to hear your opinion about this.
Well, I think there's been very interesting research in epigenetics showing the role of anticipation and how it might evolve. This has been done in bacteria, but more recently I know also of this predictive adaptive response hypothesis, which looks at metabolic mismatches that can happen based on what seems to be like a prediction of the embryo about the future nutritional resources of its environment based on what it consumes during its early development. And this is the sort of place where the researchers explicitly say that this can't be quite understood on the basis of more classical, simpler homeostatic terms, but we have to look at this anticipatory dimension, and they're going quite in detail into what might constitute this mechanism and how to study different species, because it seems to be quite a common occurrence. But of course, it remains very problematic how do we conceptualize this teleology, because we have this controversial history of the terms.
I will ask you for the references later.
Anders, thank you for an excellent talk. I am not 100% sure what do you mean by life history stages. So, according to Portmann, it's for example, change which is occurring during puberty.
Exactly. So he was especially interested in this, for example, this second developmental growth spurt. That's what happens in adolescence. And he sees this as very distinctive among other primates. So they might have some analogy to adolescence, according to later studies, but it's probably, again, very distinct in the way and the proportion that it has evolved in humans. And the other is, of course, this first year of life, this expiratory spring, which doesn't really have a close analogy at all in other primates. If we look at perhaps like measurements such as those used by Schultz in his when he came up with this table, then we can see, of course, what are the rationale for looking at this homologous or homologous life stages when we, for example, consider the eruption of first permanent teeth, the last permanent teeth, and on this basis see clearly a very conserved pattern among distinct primates. And we can, of course, sequence the whole life history on the basis of this criterion, but if we take into account a number of other ones, and especially, like I was mentioning here, like physiological ones, social ones, and etc., like Portmann was trying to do, then he clearly went in this direction of looking at qualitatively new stages. I guess I would say so. And there's been, of course, much research later on this question. I'm sure Karen can say more about this hypothesis of childhood as evolving in humans as an entirely new life stage in comparison to other primates. So this was defined as a stage of complete dependence on the social group, which follows weaning in the case of humans for another 3-4 years, and which doesn't seem to be present at all in other primates in this form. Perhaps Kari can comment more on this, and I think this is an interesting, very interesting hypothesis. It also closely resonates with many of Portmann's ideas about the importance of childhood as this period where we internalize the whole cultural legacy of the group and the cultural tools that we need to survive, etc. So this is what I mean. And again, to reiterate, my sort of evo-devo inspired question is: can there be mechanical analogies if there's an insertion of a complete qualitative new phase in this kind of developmental patterns? Can this have some mechanical analogies to the insertion of certain, let's say, morphological new segments into an animal's body plan, etc., etc.? Can we presume that these are commensurate terms or not? And if anyone knows about sources in evo-devo trying to address this, or looking at life history stages from this perspective, I would be very interested. So far, I haven't really found
Well,
I was always struck by like this idea of neoteny as being very descriptive and not really giving a mechanism for why. And then sort of evo-devo, which I don't know as much about as I should, also seems to be saying, well, this is how it could happen developmentally, but it's not really explaining it in evolutionary terms. Exactly. You know what I mean? And it's saying, well, we could go from this form to that form just by changing the developmental trajectory, not actually changing morphology or...
Yeah, but why I think Portmann already criticized this hypothesis is the fact that there might be different mechanisms behind these similarities between, let's say, young apes and adult humans. So, and if the mechanisms are completely different, then probably there is no good scientific reason to pursue it. And this is, I think, also the conclusion that has been quite clearly emerging in the last few decades, because there's been, again, interest in this whole neoteny hypothesis. And what is generally, I think, acknowledged now is that if we look at certain traits, then clearly there seems to be this heterochronic shift in humans where, for example, development takes longer to reach a certain milestone that in other primates is reached much sooner, that this immature traits that this gives rise to can actually be also understood mechanically. For example, this has been analyzed in terms of certain gene expression patterns in the brain, but this is quite different from morphology as well. So, and yes, perhaps in this highlights perhaps also a certain difficulty of evo-devo, because this has been very mechanistic science, perhaps less so in anthropology, because we simply can't do this in the case of higher primates very well, with embryological experiments, etc., etc. But and in the case of anthropology, I think that has always been quite strong morphometric tradition, and morphology has been always quite predominant in trying to analyze form and its transformation. But I think maybe a little bit less so in recent evo-devo. So I don't know.
So I think when people read Gould, they kind of had the idea that neoteny was a force or a trend.
Yeah.
That was like some kind of inevitability
Exactly.
to it, instead of just saying it's a description of how, yes, it's true that the baby chimpanzee looks more like the human than the adult does, but it's not really an explanation in any way.
Gould has been criticized, I think, quite consistently since the mid-90s. Later on, it has been quite clearly recognized that in humans there are also accelerating traits. This goes completely in the opposite direction of neoteny. I think this is called also hypermorphosis, technically. So these hypermorphic traits also occur in humans, and we can also see, for example, the development of the brain in certain aspects. So Newton is by no means a complete explanation, but here we see that both heterochromies are existent, both acceleration and deceleration in development. But the interesting point is that this still leaves the problematic of Portmann quite unresolved, because he said that we have to go beyond these heterochromic comparisons and allow for this apomorphic influences to come to the fore. And this includes heterochromies, but simply tries to reconcile the emergence of qualitative novelty with this heterochromy.